If I could go back to 25, I wouldn't speak so loudly, not with my voice, but with my effort. I wouldn't try so hard to be known, to be impressive, to prove I belonged in every room I walked into. At 25, I thought being heard meant being the smartest, the most articulate, the one who had something important to say. I talked to be understood, to be admired, to be seen, but I didn't realize I was filling every space with my own noise. Because I was afraid of the silence, afraid that if I stopped proving myself, no one would notice I was there. That if I wasn't the one contributing, I wasn't valuable. That if I didn't perform confidence, people would see the cracks underneath. So I missed things. I missed the subtle shift in a friend's voice that meant she needed someone to really ask how she was. I missed the wisdom in people I quietly labeled less evolved. I missed the way some of life's most sacred truths arrive not through speaking, but through listening. Listening not to reply, not to impress, just to witness. Now I know. You don't always need the loudest voice in the room to be heard. You don't need to prove your worth to hold space. If I could go back, I'd listen more. To others, to stillness, to the whisper in my own chest that said, you don't have to prove anything. Just be here. At 25, I didn't realize I was living in a constant state of performance. It wasn't theatrical. I wasn't putting on a show in the traditional sense, but I was always trying to prove something. Prove I was smart. Prove I was capable. Prove I belonged. Prove I wasn't just another insecure girl trying to find her footing in the world. So I became what people call driven. I answered emails immediately, spoke clearly and confidently in meetings, posted thoughtful captions, spoke in podcast voice even when I was tired, knew the right books to reference, the current events to have an opinion on, the trends to challenge and support. But underneath it was fear. Fear of being underestimated, fear of being invisible, fear of being dismissed. So I made proving myself a personality. I let it lead every interaction. Every conversation became a quiet negotiation for respect. Every silence felt like a challenge I had to fill with value. I wasn't listening. I was positioning. Even in friendships, even in love. I needed people to know I was useful, that I brought something to the table, that I wasn't average. I wanted to be undeniable. But here's the truth no one talks about. Proving yourself all the time is a trauma response in disguise. It's what happens when you grow up being told you have to earn your worth, with grades, with gold stars, with endless potential. It's what happens when you believe people only stay if you're impressive. So you become impressive, but never truly present. You're always calculating, always performing, always tightening. You mistake your identity for your resume. You forget how to just exist without performing value in every breath. And the worst part? You don't even realize how exhausting it is until you stop. Because proving feels like purpose until it starts to feel like panic. Until you wake up and wonder why you're still tired after sleeping, why you still feel unseen after all the things you said, why you still feel like a fraud, even when everyone else is clapping. That's when it hit me. This isn't confidence. It's survival. And surviving isn't the same as living. If I could go back to 25, I'd tell her she didn't need to fill every silence with strength. That softness wasn't weakness. That being quiet didn't mean being small. I'd tell her that being present, being real, that's enough. You don't have to be impressive to matter. You already do. Listening sounds so simple, doesn't it? But when you've built your identity around being heard, being seen, being understood, listening can feel like surrender. At 25, I didn't know how to listen without trying to fix, impress, or respond. Silence made me twitch. Pauses made me anxious. Letting someone else speak too long made me feel irrelevant. So I jumped in, finished their sentences, nodded before they were done, offered advice they didn't ask for, not out of arrogance, but out of fear. Because deep down, listening felt like losing control. If I wasn't steering the conversation, would I still matter in it? If I wasn't adding value, would I still be valued? If I let people talk without proving I had something meaningful to say, would they forget I was even there? That's what no one tells you when you grow up being praised for being articulate, for being mature beyond your years, for being so wise for your age. You start to believe your voice is the most important thing about you. So when it's time to just listen, really listen, it feels like erasure. It feels like shrinking. It feels like fading into the background of someone else's story. And that's terrifying when your self-worth is wrapped in being unforgettable. But slowly and painfully, I started to learn. Listening isn't passive. It's powerful. It's choosing to make space when your ego wants to speak. It's deciding not to interrupt someone's unfolding just because you're uncomfortable with not being the focus. It's witnessing, not fixing. It's holding, not handling. And most of all, listening is control of a different kind. Not control over the room. Control over your own need to be at the center of it. When I finally started practicing real listening, not the kind where I was just waiting for my turn to speak, I noticed everything changed. Conversations slowed down. People opened up. I started to hear what was underneath their words, not just their sentences, but their soul. I learned that not every silence needs to be filled, that sometimes the most powerful response is your presence. And perhaps most humbling of all, I realized how much I'd missed, how many lessons, how much wisdom, how much depth, because I was too busy trying to sound wise myself. I thought listening meant fading, but it turns out it means trusting. Trusting that you don't need to be the loudest to be felt. Trusting that you don't need to prove your intelligence with every breath. Trusting that being there, truly there, is more than enough. If I could go back to 25, I'd tell her this. Let go of the spotlight. Let go of the performance. Let go of needing to control the moment. Just listen. You might be surprised what you hear, in them and in yourself. At 25, I was drawn to bold voices. Charismatic, confident, commanding. The people who knew how to hold a room, the ones who made you feel like something important was always about to happen when they spoke. That's who I tried to be. That's who I thought mattered most. I overlooked the quiet ones, the ones who spoke slowly, who paused often, who chose their words like they were handling something sacred. I mistook their silence for passivity, their stillness for uncertainty, their calm for smallness. But as I learned to listen more and prove less, I started to hear them, really hear them. And when I did, I realized they'd been saying the most important things all along. It was the soft-spoken friend who once said, "I think we rush too much to respond instead of understand." And I felt my stomach tighten, because that's exactly what I did, over and over. It was the colleague who rarely spoke up, but when she did, she offered the most grounded, thoughtful insight, the kind that changed the entire direction of the room. It was the older woman I met in a cafe who told me the loudest person often just needs the most approval. The quietest, they already have it from themselves. And that hit me. Because at 25, I was loud. I was polished. I was performing confidence I didn't fully feel. And the quiet people, they weren't trying to be anything. They just were. Unshaken. Unimpressed. Not racing to be understood, because they'd made peace with not being everyone's favorite voice in the room. And here's what I learned. Volume doesn't measure wisdom. Speed doesn't equal insight. And silence is not a weakness. It's often a choice. The quiet people taught me how to breathe between sentences, how to listen without waiting to speak, how to hold space without needing to fill it. They taught me that presence isn't proven, it's felt. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not speak until there's something true to say. But perhaps most importantly, they taught me that confidence isn't always loud. Sometimes it's steady. Sometimes it's gentle. Sometimes it says, I don't need to be understood right now to know my worth. And when I let go of my need to constantly prove I was worthy of attention, I began to admire them in a new way. Not for their volume, but for their restraint. For their ability to sit with uncertainty, to not rush, to be fully present without performance. If I could go back to 25, I'd sit beside the quiet ones. I'd ask fewer questions and let the moment answer them. I'd watch how they move through the world, slow, aware, intentional. And I'd realize, maybe I wasn't actually confident back then. I was just loud because I was scared to be still. But stillness? Stillness has depth. Stillness has presence. Stillness has wisdom. And the quiet people taught me all of that, without ever raising their voice. Listening isn't just about hearing words. That's something I didn't understand at 25. I thought being a good listener meant not interrupting, nodding in the right places, making eye contact, maybe even repeating something back so they knew I was paying attention. And yes, that matters. But real listening, the kind that changes relationships, deepens intimacy, heals old wounds, it's about hearing what isn't being said. It's about tuning in to the pause between sentences, the moment someone inhales sharply but doesn't speak. It's about watching their eyes flicker when they say, "I'm fine," and knowing they're anything but. It's noticing how they tighten their jaw when their ex's name comes up, how they look away when asked about their childhood, how they smile too quickly after sharing something that should have made them cry. That's the real conversation. But back then, I was too focused on my part, too caught up in sounding wise, offering comfort, showing up the right way. I was listening to reply, not to receive. And I missed so much. I missed what people were asking for in the silences. I missed when they were testing the water, saying something small just to see if it was safe to say more. I missed the trembling under their strength. Because when someone says, "I don't need to talk about it," sometimes they do. When someone says, "It's not a big deal," sometimes it's the biggest one. But you have to listen past the sentence. You have to hear the energy beneath the words. And that takes stillness. That takes trust. It takes slowing down enough to be fully with someone, not just in the room, but in the moment. I remember once a friend of mine, strong, independent, always composed, texted me, "Rough day, but I'm good. Don't worry." And something in me paused. Normally, I'd send a heart emoji, a "you got this" text, maybe crack a joke to lift the mood. But that day, I didn't do any of that. I called her. She didn't answer. So I drove to her apartment and sat on her doorstep. When she opened the door 30 minutes later, her eyes were red. She didn't say a word, just pulled me inside and hugged me so hard it cracked something in both of us. Later, she said, "I've never had someone hear me when I was trying not to say anything." That moment changed me because I realized how many times I'd missed those cues in others and how many times I'd hidden behind those same polite sentences myself, hoping someone would see through them. We are always communicating, even in silence. And sometimes the deepest kind of listening is believing someone's body language more than their words. It's noticing who suddenly goes quiet in a group, who always changes the subject, who rarely talks about themselves unless you ask twice. It's looking at someone and gently saying, "Hey, you don't have to explain it, but I'm here, and I see you." That's a kind of love that doesn't need applause. And that's the kind of listener I wish I'd been sooner. If I could go back to 25, I'd stop waiting for people to say everything clearly. I'd start learning the language of hesitations, of glances, of silence. Because the people who are hurting the most, they're not always the ones talking. They're often the ones hoping, quietly, desperately, that someone will finally hear what they've never known how to say. There was a time in my life, especially around 25, when conversations felt like competitions. Not overtly, not with raised voices or aggressive debates, but quietly, subtly. Beneath every interaction was the need to win. Win respect, win validation, win the final word, the best insight, the smartest take. I measured my worth by how eloquently I could respond, how quickly I could counter, how effortlessly I could wrap up someone's vulnerability with a neat little bow of perspective. It wasn't about ego. At least, I didn't think so. It was about fear. Fear that if I didn't sound smart, I'd be dismissed. Fear that if I didn't hold my ground, I'd look weak. Fear that if I wasn't the one with the answers, I wouldn't be needed anymore. So I jumped in early, talked fast, had stats, stories, and solutions lined up like armor. I didn't leave room for people to process because silence made me nervous, like a stage where I had to perform worthiness again and again. But then one day, something shifted. I was sitting across from someone I deeply respected. Older, softer, slower in speech. They listened more than they spoke. And when they did speak, it landed like truth. That day, I was in full performance mode, trying to sound insightful, trying to say something that mattered. I can't even remember what I said, but I remember what they said after. "You don't have to convince me. I'm already with you." And just like that, something unraveled in my chest. I realized I'd been treating every conversation like a courtroom, every thought like a case to defend. I was trying to win people, win their belief, win their approval, win their attention. But you know what the cost of winning was? Connection. Because when your goal is to win, you stop being curious. You stop being with people. You start treating their words like stepping stones toward your next brilliant thought. And slowly you lose the intimacy that real conversation invites. That day, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let myself not respond. I just nodded, breathed, let the conversation sit, didn't reach for a clever reply. And in that space, there was something better than a mic drop moment. There was peace. There was presence. There was the deep, soul-settling understanding that I didn't need to win this person. I didn't need to impress them. I didn't need to outshine, outperform, or outsmart anyone. I just needed to be here, honest, open, quiet when needed. Because the best conversations aren't won. They're shared. They aren't battles. They're bridges. And the most magnetic people aren't the ones who dominate every discussion. They're the ones who make space in it. Space to wonder, to question, to change your mind. To not know, to just feel. If I could go back to 25, I'd let more people finish their thoughts. I'd say that makes sense more than, but have you considered? I'd choose connection over cleverness. Because being heard feels good, but being understood, truly understood, that feels like coming home. I used to think that power lived in my voice. Not just any voice, but a voice that knew. A voice that could articulate, lead, correct, explain, inspire. At 25, I thought the most powerful person in the room was the one doing the most talking, the one who had answers, the one who filled the space with clarity, the one who took charge of the moment. And for a long time, I played that role. I spoke up in meetings, filled silences with insight, jumped in to smooth over tension, guide the conversation, steer it somewhere useful. I thought that was leadership. I thought that was confidence. But what I didn't realize is that I was terrified of being irrelevant. Silence felt like shrinking. Letting someone else speak first felt like surrendering power. Pausing felt like weakness. So I made sure my voice was present. Loud enough, smart enough, useful enough. But here's the truth I couldn't see back then. Real power doesn't always speak. Sometimes it simply holds presence, holds tension, holds the moment without needing to dominate it. Because when you're truly powerful, you don't need to prove it with words. You can sit back and let the room unfold. You can let others rise. You can let the conversation breathe. You don't flinch at silence because silence doesn't threaten your identity. And more than that, you don't fear not being seen because you've already seen yourself. When I finally started to listen more, not just to others, but to myself, I realized how much of my leadership was really self-protection. I was filling the space because I was afraid of what it would feel like if I didn't. Would they forget I was there? Would they think I had nothing to offer? Would they stop respecting me? That fear drove everything. And it's so common, especially when you grow up in environments that reward certainty. Environments where being quiet gets mistaken for being unqualified. Where being thoughtful is treated as weakness. Where being soft is a liability. But real leadership? It's not volume. It's not presence measured in airtime. It's discernment. Knowing when to speak and when not to. Knowing when your voice serves the room and when silence serves it more. It's about listening deeply and letting others feel safe being heard. It's about trusting that you don't lose power when others take up space. You expand it. Now, I've sat in rooms with the most powerful people I've ever met. And they're not the ones talking the most. They're the ones listening the hardest. They're not rushing to respond. They're not interrupting to appear sharp. They're not afraid to say, I don't know, because their worth isn't tangled up in sounding right. They've already made peace with who they are, and that's what makes them magnetic. So if I could go back to 25, I'd whisper this in her ear before every meeting, every conversation, every moment of over-explaining. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to speak to be seen. You don't have to lead the moment to belong in it. Power isn't the loudest voice in the room. Power is the one that doesn't need to speak over others to know it matters. There was a time when silence felt like failure. If I didn't have something to say, something smart, strong, useful, I thought I was fading. At 25, silence made me anxious. I filled it with jokes, with insight, with commentary. I was afraid people would get bored, afraid they'd think I was disengaged, afraid they'd stop listening if I wasn't constantly talking. I measured presence in volume, belonging in words, and identity in output. But silence felt like disappearing. Until it didn't. Until one day I found myself in a conversation where I had nothing to prove and everything to learn. I was sitting across from someone who didn't rush, didn't dominate, didn't demand attention. They just listened. Not performatively, but with full presence. Not to prepare a response, but to receive. And in their quiet, I felt seen. Not because they were filling the air with admiration, but because their silence held space. There was no pressure to impress, no race to reply, just a softness, an openness, a sense that nothing had to be earned in this moment. That conversation didn't change because of what was said. It changed because of what wasn't, and something clicked. Silence isn't weakness, it's strength, in its most grounded form. It's the power to be fully present without scrambling to perform. It's the calm that doesn't need to interrupt, fix, or one-up. It's the energy that says, I trust this moment, I trust myself, and I trust you enough not to fill every space between us. So I started practicing it. Not as avoidance, but as presence. Silence in arguments, when I didn't need to win. Silence in love, when holding their hand said more than words could. Silence in grief, when comfort didn't come in phrases, but in just being there. I learned that silence is where the truth rises. It's where emotion finally has room to stretch, where people say the real thing, the thing underneath the thing, because you gave them time, where you hear your own voice more clearly without the noise of performance. Silence helped me hear things I'd been talking over for years, my body's quiet cries for rest, my heart's longing for slowness, my soul's ache for depth. It helped me see people more clearly, not just what they said, but how they sat, how they breathed, how they waited. And I learned this. Silence is a mirror. It shows you what's really there, in them and in you. It reveals who can sit in it and who runs. It reveals which relationships are built on connection and which are held up by noise. And maybe most importantly, it revealed me. The me who didn't need to be the most articulate. The me who didn't need to prove her presence through constant commentary. The me who could say more with stillness than she ever could with sound. Now, silence is my reset button, my sacred space, my superpower. It's the pause before the reaction, the breath before the truth, the choice to listen when ego wants to speak. If I could go back to 25, I'd tell her, let the quiet moments live. Don't rush to fill them. Don't fear the space between words. That space, that's where everything real begins. I used to work so hard to be interesting. I read the right books, stayed up to date on the news, memorized niche facts, quirky opinions, clever jokes. I curated a version of myself that felt fresh, thoughtful, different, like I had something new to offer in every conversation, a reason to be remembered, to be liked, to be wanted, because underneath the need to be interesting was the fear of being forgettable. At 25, I didn't realize it, but every time I tried to be the most in the room, the smartest, the funniest, the most passionate, the most deep, what I really wanted was to be safe. Safe from being overlooked, safe from being just another face in a crowd, safe from the ache of invisibility. So I crafted conversation like performance. Every word was placed with purpose. I was proud of how quick I could be, how insightful, how charming, and people noticed. But I noticed something else. I was exhausted. Exhausted from the pressure of having to be on all the time. Exhausted from the fear that if I didn't show up as interesting, people would walk away. Exhausted from editing myself in real time, always scanning for what would land best. And in all that proving, I missed presence. I missed the joy of just being with people without the script. I missed the softness of asking questions without turning them into mirrors. I missed the connection that comes from not performing. The shift happened slowly. One day, I was sitting with someone who wasn't trying to be anything. They weren't dropping hot takes or telling wild stories. They weren't quoting articles or threading philosophical metaphor. Just there. Open. Curious. Calm. And you know what I felt? Relieved. Because I didn't have to perform either. I could just sit, sip coffee, say something ordinary, be seen without sparkle. That's when it hit me. Interesting isn't what people remember. Authentic is. You don't have to impress people to be magnetic. You don't have to have the best story. You don't have to stand out. You just have to be with them. Be honest. Be still. Be curious. Not captivating. The moment I stopped trying to be interesting, I became more interested. And in that, I became more real. I started asking more questions than I answered, started listening to learn, not just to respond, started showing up without the pressure to be brilliant, just the intention to be present. And that changed everything, because when you stop trying to be impressive, people relax around you. They unfold, they tell the truth, they stop performing too. And in that shared softness, you find what most of us are really looking for. Not entertainment, not admiration, not even validation, but belonging. If I could go back to 25, I'd sit her down gently and say, you don't have to be fascinating to be loved. You don't have to prove your depth to be respected. You don't have to carry the room with your words. Just be in it. That's more than enough. We live in a world that teaches us how to speak, how to brand ourselves, market ourselves, pitch ourselves. We're told to be bold, be loud, be unforgettable. But almost no one teaches us how to listen. Real listening. Not the kind where you nod while mentally rehearsing your reply. Not the kind where you wait for your turn to speak. Not the kind where you jump in with advice the second someone pauses. I'm talking about the kind of listening that feels like holding. That sacred, focused, full-body kind of presence that says, you don't have to perform right now. I'm here. I see you. I'm staying. At 25, I didn't know how to give that kind of gift because I didn't know how to give it to myself. I was too busy proving, explaining, curating, too busy trying to sound like I had it together, even when I felt like I was quietly falling apart. And because I was always performing, I didn't realize how rare, how healing it is to simply be heard. Not analyzed, not solved, not fixed, just heard. It wasn't until someone did that for me, sat across from me, put their phone down, and just listened without flinching at my mess, that I finally understood the gift I had been withholding from others. Because when someone listens like that, really listens, they tell you, you are not too much, you are not a burden, you are safe here. And how many of us are aching for exactly that? To be met without judgment, to speak without editing. To be real without fearing we'll be rejected. That's what listening gives. And here's the wild part. It costs nothing. You don't need a degree. You don't need to have the right words. You don't need to fix someone's life. You just need to be there. Fully, quietly, openly. No interruption, no advice unless asked. No at leasts or you shoulds or I went through that too. Just presence. I used to think love was shown through grand gestures, perfect advice, thoughtful insights. Now I know. Some of the deepest love you'll ever offer someone is letting them talk and not needing to steal the moment. Letting them cry and not filling the silence. Letting them be messy and staying anyway. Because what we all want, beneath the striving, beneath the masks, is to be known. And that kind of knowing doesn't come from speaking well. It comes from listening deeply. If I could go back to 25, I'd stop obsessing over saying the right thing. I'd start practicing the brave, sacred art of staying quiet long enough to truly hear someone. I'd remember that our ears are better healers than our mouths. And I'd understand that listening, fully, humbly, with your whole heart, isn't just kindness. It's a revolution. If you're 25 right now, you're probably trying really hard to figure out who you are, while also trying really hard to make sure everyone else approves of that person. You're likely torn between two voices, the one that whispers, slow down, be real, be here, and the one that screams, be better, go faster, say something impressive. You're smart, you care, you want to live deeply, love fully, do something that matters. But sometimes, you just want to be enough, without having to earn it. And maybe no one told you this, so let me say it now, plainly, gently, and with love. You don't have to prove anything today. Not your intelligence, not your usefulness, not your strength, not your talent, not your value. You already are. You've spent so long trying to be heard, trying to craft the right sentence, the right answer, the right opinion, because somewhere deep down, you believed your voice was the only thing tethering you to mattering. You've performed confidence like a second skin. You've become fluent in urgency. You've made eye contact and said, I'm fine, when your soul was aching for softness. But hear me, you don't have to keep performing to be loved. Your value isn't in your volume. Your worth isn't measured by the impact of your words. Sometimes your presence is enough. Your silence is enough. Your stillness is more than enough. If you're 25 right now and you feel behind, Remember, there is no finish line. There is no version of you that will finally silence every insecurity. There is only this you, today's version. And she is worthy of care, of rest, of being listened to by herself. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to have it all mapped out. You don't have to be the best in every room. What you need, what we all need, is a little more listening to others, to the world, to the version of you who isn't trying to be liked, but trying to breathe. Sit with her. Hear what she's been trying to say beneath the noise. She doesn't need you to speak perfectly. She just needs you to be present and to trust that the life you're building isn't made in grand gestures or viral moments, but in the quiet decisions to be real, again and again. If you're 25 right now, let the silence be your teacher. Let your ears lead more than your mouth. Let your heart soften instead of harden. Because what you'll realize, maybe not today, but someday, is that your greatest strength was never in proving how interesting you were. It was in becoming someone who knows how to see others, to hear them, to witness them, to make space. And in doing so, you'll create space for yourself too. Not the curated version, not the one with the answers. The real you, the one who deserves to be listened to. Not because she's perfect, but because she exists. If you're 25 right now, don't rush past this season. Don't numb the quiet. Don't trade your softness for survival. Listen to what you don't say, to the ones who love without fanfare, to the voice inside that says, you don't need to prove who you are. You already are. That voice, let her speak, and then listen.